A Critical History of English Literature, Volume I. David Daiches. A Critical History of English Literature, IN 2 volumes, tilde, Volume I, tilde. London, Seaker and Warburg, 1961. Printed in Great Bridge London by Morrison and Gibb Limited, Lormdale ad Edinburgh, and published in Great Britain B_LI, Clarton Seaker and Warburg Limited, 7 John Street, London, W.C.L. Copyright J 960 by T.H.E. Ronald Press Company. First published September 1960. Reprinted December 1960. Reprinted February 1961. To my former students. On both sides of the Atlantic. Pero pervaet and asilta. Preface. Tills is an AGE of specialist. Show yours, and for one man to attempt to complete history of English literature is now both rash and unusual. I cannot claim to be a specialist in all the periods on which I have written, nor, in spite of my best attempts, have I been able to keep abreast of all new developments in English studies, but I have been reading English literature continuously and closely ever since I began my studies at Edinburgh University in 1930, and I have long felt the urge to describe the whole scene as I see it. This, therefore, is one man's history of English literature. It is intended less as a work of reference than as a work of description, explanation, and critical interpretation. It is not meant to be looked up, but to be read. I have given myself generous space in dealing with major figures such as Shakespeare and Milton, without bothering whether, in strict terms of relative greatness, they deserve so much more than I have given to some other writers. Indeed, the chapters on Shakespeare and Milton can perhaps stand as independent critical studies, capable of being extracted from the rest of the history and read as short books on their own. Nevertheless, the word critical in my title is important. I have tried never to lose sight of the fact that this is a history, not a series of separate critical studies, and the appropriate kinds of historical generalizations and the proper continuity of narrative have, I hope, been maintained throughout. I may sometimes have treated a minor writer who interests me particularly at greater length than he deserves, or rather briefly summarized something important and well known, but I have tried to see my subject steadily, and see it whole. And I have tried to write interestingly, less as the impersonal scholar recording facts than as the interested reader sharing his knowledge and opinions. On matters of pure scholarship I have, of course, often had to depend on the researches of others. On questions of emphasis and v.l. preface assessment I have done so as little as possible, although occasionally even the most conscientious critical historian must be content to take the word of a empathetic expert about the value of an odd minor work to which he himself has never devoted a great deal of careful attention. Art is long and life is short, and one cannot always be wholly original in everything. I hope, however, that the pattern which a single mind imposes on this vast material will make my account more lively and suggestive than the conscientious composite works of reference by teams of experts, from which I have myself profited but which are not literary history in the sense that this book is intended to be. I have been more liberal in quotation from the works under discussion than is usual for a literary historian. I have found that the critical side of the work demands this. I have been deliberately inconsistent in the lengths of my quotations. As a rule I have modernized spelling and punctuation, though not in Middle English texts, which lose too much by such modernization. In 16th, 17th and 18th century texts I have retained the original spelling where it is important as giving a period flavour or indicating some historical aspects of the language or of literary convention. Otherwise I have modernized it. My principle in this and other matters has been maximum ease of reading compatible with sound scholarship and intellectual responsibility. David Daiches. Jesus College, Cambridge. February, 1960. Contents. Volume I. Chapter. PAGE. 1. Anglo-Saxon Literature. 3. 2. The Development of Middle English Prose ND. 31. Verse. 3. Middle English Literature, Fabula, Lyric, Dream, 68. Allegory, Ballad. 89. 4. Chaucer, Gower, Piers Plowman. 5. The end of the Middle Age EES. 128. 6. The early Tudor scene CI. 146. 7. Spenser and his time. 165. 8. Drama from the Miracle Plays to Marlowe. 208. 9. Shakespeare. 246. 10. Drama from Johnson to the closing of the theatres. 309. 11. Poetry after Spenser, John Sonlin and the META. 346. Physical traditions. 12. Milton. 390. 13. Prose in the 16th and 17th centuries. 458. 14. Scottish Literature. 1700. v. 504. v. Contents. Volume 2. Page. Chapter 1. The Restoration. 537. 2. The Augustan Age. Defoe, Swift, Pope. 590. 3. Poetry from Thomson to Crabbe. 652. 4. The novel from Richardson to Jane Austen. 700. 5. 18th century philosophical, historical, and critical prose, and miscellaneous writing. 6. Scottish literature from Alan Ramsay to Walter. 809. Scott. 7. The Romantic Poets. I. Blake, Wordsworth, A.N.D. 856. Coleridge. 8. The Romantic Poets. 9. F. Miller. 2. Shelley, Keats, and Byron. 935. Victorian prose. John Henry Newman to William. 961. Morris. 11. The Victorian poets. 12. The Victorian novel. 13. Drama from the century. 14. 905. Crunkle, A.N.D. Miscellaneous prose of the early and middle 19th century. 10. 766. 993.0. Beginning with 1049. The 18th. 1094. Epilogue. After the Victorians. 1113. Index. 1139. A Critical History of English Literature. Volume I. Chapter. O.N.E. Anglo-Saxon Literature. The Anglo-Saxon invaders, who came to Britain in the latter part of the 5th century AD, and eventually established their kingdoms there, were the founders of what we can properly call English culture and English literature. They gave England its name, its language, and its links with Germania, that great body of Teutonic peoples whose migrations disrupted the Roman Empire and utterly changed the face of Europe. Some 400 years before they arrived in Britain, the Roman historian Tacitus had given his account of the Germanic peoples and how they looked to his civilized Roman eyes. And though we can see that Tacitus, Germania, idealizes the barbarians in order to hold up the noble savage as an example to decadent Rome, we can nevertheless trace in his account something of the qualities of these people as they emerge out of the mists of history and legend at a later period. To Romans, whose world they threatened and finally overcame, they were barbarians, appearing out of nowhere to end danger, with their primitive vigor and alien ways of thought. Both the political structure of the Delta Empire and the ideological structure of Greco-Roman thought. After the Roman Empire had become Christianized, the contrast between barbarian and Roman was even more striking, for the former were heathen in their life and their society reflected heroic ideals far removed from Roman Christian theory or practice. Yet the history of much of Europe in the so-called Dark Ages is the story of the gradual fusion of these two ways of life and thought, the growing together of barbarian and Christian, and the grounding of both in an appropriately modified phase of the Greco-Roman tradition. Precisely who the invaders were whom we have for so long called Anglo-Saxon is not of primary importance to the student of literature. that they belong to the group of Teutonic peoples to which we can appropriately give Tacitus' name of Germania is clear, according to Bede, writing his ecclesiastical history of England to Huns. 4. Anglo-Saxon literature. Dread years and more after their arrival, they came from 3 very powerful nations of the Germans, that is, from the Saxons, Angli, and the Uli. We know something about the Saxons, who appear to have come from the Low Country south of Denmark and east of Holland, the modern Holstein. The Angles appear to have lived in modern Jutland and the neighbouring islands before they appeared in Britain, while the Jutes, whose origin is the most obscure of the 3, perhaps came from the country east of the Lower Rhine and perhaps, though less probably, the apparent similarity of names not being the cogent argument it might appear to the modern mere, from Jutland. In Anglo-Saxon England there were Saxon kingdoms, in the south and southwest, Anglian kingdoms, in the east, north, and Midlands, and the Lutish kingdom of Kent in the southeast. The cultural differences between the 3 groups are of comparatively little moment. Their language was essentially the same, though with important dialectical differences, and they all considered themselves part of Germania, that loosely associated group of peoples who included Goths, Burgundians, Lombards, and others, and who had a common set of heroes who might belong to any one of these. Of the Romanized Britons whom the invading Anglo-Saxons pushed into western corners of England, the historian of English literature has little to say. A Celtic people who had been taken into the Roman Empire, they were left to fend for themselves when the Romans, desperately trying to hold their empire together against barbarian invaders, withdrew from England in AD 410. A prey to the ruder Picts and Scots in the north, they soon found themselves more seriously threatened by the invaders from across the North Sea, to whom they were an alien people known as Welsh, which was simply the Germanic people's name for foregoers who were not part of Germania. Only in Wales have these Cambro-Britons continuously preserved their language and their traditions. Their contribution to specifically English literature is sporadic and oblique, and does not appear until long after the Anglo-Saxon period. If Arthur, who plays such an important part in Middle English romance, was really a historical Cambro-British character from this period, and we have no mention of him before the 9th century except for a passing remark by an early 7th century Welsh poet that a Sir Jane Warrior, Wilhrave, was not Arthur, there is still no reason for considering his metamorphosis into a hero of medieval romance and a focus for a host of Arthurian stories as any part of a direct and continuous heritage from Celtic Britain into later times. It was not until the 12th century, when English literature sought its inspiration from the French, that the Arthurian Romances began to Anglo-Saxon literature 5 appear, and while it is true that it was an Englishman, Geoffrey of Monmouth, who first elaborated the Arthurian story, in his Historia Regum Britanniae, to provide rich material for these romances, the Anglo-French development of the material is very far removed from any Celtic origins. Whatever the origins of the Arthurian story, therefore, we are justified in beginning the history of English literature with the Anglo-Saxons. Of surviving Anglo-Saxon literature, that which brings us most closely into contact with the Germanic origins of the invaders is the heroic poetry, which still bears traces not only of the pre-Christian heroic society of the continental Saxons and authors, but also of the community of subject which linked these early English with the wider civilization of Germania. This is written in the language we know as Old English or Anglo-Saxon, which is essentially the English language in an earlier stage of its development, with inflections which have since disappeared, a relatively small vocabulary from which many words have since been lost, though some which are lost to Standard English remain in altered form in Scots and in regional English dialects, and significant differences between, for example, the West Saxon dialect of the south and the Anglian dialect of Northumbria. The verse is alliterative and stressed, without rhyme, each line containing 4 stressed syllables and a varying number unstressed. There is a definite pause, caesura, between the 2 halves of each line, with 2 stresses in each half. We giske Norman Conquest, Welfen poet, Oat Widio, Katina Rices, Protras Grimsinning. S. Sic monig sorgem gebunden. Wienan Weisgenia. Pretz pres signerisses. Offercumen. To the superficial eye this looks very far removed from modern English, and in a sense it is. The letter P, thorn, has the sound of th, but a literal translation helps to bring out its relation to modern English. We have learned of Ormanric's wolfish disposition. He held wide dominion in the reign of the Goths. That was a cruel king. Many a man sat bound in sorrows, anticipating woe, often wishing that his kingdom were overcome. 6. Anglo-Saxon Literature. Some 30,000 lines of Anglo-Saxon poetry have survived, nearly all of it contained in 4 manuscripts, and we have no reason to believe that the older, non-religious poetry that survives is more than a casually preserved fragment of what was written. Specifically, religious poetry might be expected to have earned ecclesiastical care and preservation, but the heroic poetry which connects more directly with the Germanic origins of the Anglo-Saxons could not be expected to arouse any special ecclesiastical interest even when it had been superficially purged of its pagan feeling and in some degree Christianized in thought. The conversion of the English peoples began with the arrival of Augustine in Kent in 597. He had been sent by Gregory the Great with a band of monks in order to achieve this missionary task. But, though Ethelbert, King of Kent, was duly converted to Christianity and Augustine was soon able to establish the seat of his bishopric at Canterbury, the permanent establishment of Christianity throughout England proved a much lengthier task and one which required the active intervention of Celtic missionaries from Ireland and Scotland. Differences between the customs and practices of the Irish Church, which had remained somewhat isolated from Rome, and the Roman Church, which had sponsored Augustine's mission, made for certain difficulties between those English ecclesiastics who looked to Rome and those who looked to Iona and to Ireland, and these were not resolved until the Synod of Whitby in 663. But it is sufficient for the historian of literature to note that the development of English Christianity was not continuous but sporadic for the first century and more, with certain notable setbacks such as the defeat and death of the Christian Edwin, King of Northumbria, at the hands of the pagan Penda, King of Massia, in 632, which meant the disappearance of the Christian Church in Northumbria until its re-establishment by Aidan and his followers from Iona. If even the external ecclesiastical organization was thus unstable in the early centuries, it is not difficult to see how traces of pagan thought and varying kinds of relation to Christianity persisted for some time after the nominal conversion of the English. These are 1. Emma's Cotton Vitellius of 15 in the British Museum, which contains Beowulf, Judith, and 3 prose works. 2. The Junius manuscript in the Bodleian Library, Oxford, MS Bodleian Junius 11, which contains Genesis, Exodus, Daniel, and Christ and Satan. 3. The Exeter Book, given by Bishop Leofric to Exeter Cathedral, containing Christ, Juliana, the Wanderer, the Seafarer, Widsith, Deor, and many other short pieces. 4. The Vercelli Book, preserved in the Cathedral Library of Vercelli, in northern Italy. WH1CH contains Andreas dealt the Fates Odds the Apostles, Address of the Soul to the Body, The Dream of the Rood, and Eileen. 2. Not 664, as is traditionally held. BP.de dates at 664, but he begins his year in September, and as the Synod can be shown to have been held in late September or early October, this would mean 663 in our dating. Anglo-Saxon Literature. 7. Unfortunately, though much is known in general about the mythology of the Germanic and the Norse peoples, we have very little definite information about the heathen background of Old English culture. Though we can draw analogies between what we know of Scandinavian heathendom and what we surmise of its Old English equivalent, the fact remains that the common origin of the two was already far in the past by the time we find the Anglo-Saxons in England. Old English place names give some indication of pre-Christian activity associated with certain localities in Anglo-Saxon England, but tell us nothing of the larger patterns of attitude and belief which are of the most relevance for a study of the literature. That Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry, even as we have it, is the product of a pagan, heroic society, and in social tone and general mood bears evidence of its origins, can hardly be disputed. But debate on the degree to which Beowulf, for example, has been modified by relatively sophisticated Latin culture, not only by Christian sentiment but, as has been claimed, by a Virgilian tradition, cannot be resolved without knowledge of more details than it seems likely we shall ever possess about primitive Anglo-Saxon beliefs. On the whole, it would seem likely that Beowulf and such other remains of early English heroic poetry as survive are closer to their pagan origins in mood and purpose than is sometimes believed. Though there are difficulties in placing the earliest extant Anglo-Saxon poetry in its cultural context, we can take some comfort from the knowledge that what has survived of Anglo-Saxon poetry, fragmentary though it is and an arbitrary sample though it may be, is of earlier date than any extant poetry of the Untitled or Germanic literatures of Old High German or Old Norse. For example, Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry is the nearest we can get to the oral pagan literature of the heroic age of Germania. The stressed alliterative verse of Anglo-Saxon poetry is clearly the product of an oral court minstrelsy. It was intended to be recited by the scop, the itinerant minstrel who frequented the halls of kings and chiefs and sometimes found continuous service with one master. One of the earliest surviving Anglo-Saxon poems, Widsith, is the autobiographical record of such a scop. The poem as we have it is probably not homogeneous. Some of the lines seem to be later interpolations, but the core of the work finally depicts a heroic attitude to the bard's function and gives us a fascinating glimpse of the Germanic world as it appeared to the imagination of the Anglo-Saxons. The text we have of the poem is in the Exeter Book, and is thus 10th century and in the West Saxon dialect. The poem, which must have been originally composed in Northumbria, dates from the late 7th or early 8th century. 8. Anglo-Saxon literature. Though parts of it must be older even than that. Widsith, the far wanderer, tells of his travels throughout the Germanic world and mentions the many rulers he has visited. Many of the characters he mentions figure in other poems in Beowulf, for example, and in the fragmentary stories of Finodwaldr. The princes he claims to have visited cover virtually the whole Germanic world, and their lifetimes extend over 200 years. He was, he tells us, with Ermanric, the Gothic king who died about 370. Likewise I was in Italy with Leofwine, he tells us elsewhere in the poem, and Leofwine is Alboin, king of the Lombards, who died about 572, and who is, incidentally, the latest character to be mentioned in any Germanic heroic poem. The comic poem thus cannot be true autobiography. It is, however, something much more interesting than that. It is a view of Germanic history and geography as it appeared to a Northumbrian bard of the 7th century, drawing on the traditions of his people. What strikes us most forcibly is its Catholicity. Praise is meted out impartially to Huns, Goths, Burgundians, Franks, Danes, Swedes, Angles, Wends, Saxons, Langobards, and many others. Like Attilage ruled the Huns, Ermanric the Goths, Becker the Bannings, Giffic of the Burgundians, Theodric ruled the Franks, Thlerondings, Breoc of the Brondings, Billing the Wrimas, Oswine ruled the Eowen, and Gefwulf the Jutes, Finfolk walding the race of the Frisians. Oher ruled Angel, Iluth the Danes. He was the most courageous of all these men, but he did not excel Oher in his mighty deeds. We are given here a bird's eye view of the subject matter of Germanic heroic poetry, and we are reminded that the heroes of that poetry were not regional or national but common to all Germania. Widsith may be primitive stuff as poetry indeed. The first catalogue of rulers in the poem is cast in the form of a very early type of genealogical verse and may well date from the beginning of the 6th century or even from before the coming of the Anglo-Saxons to Britain, but it is this very primitive quality which is of most interest. In its combination of historical memories and heroic traditions, it shows us something of the historical foundations of heroic poetry and reminds us of the nature and extent of that wide world of Germania which the author of Beowulf was equally to take for granted, as familiar to his audience and thus as suitable material for allusion and analogy. The whole world of barbarian wanderings and conquests, the world which collided with, in a sense destroyed, and in a sense was absorbed by the Roman Empire is here sketched out, and that world provides the orchestration, as it were, for Beowulf. Beowulf holds a special position in Anglo-Saxon literature, indeed, in older Germanic literature as a whole, because it is the only Anglo-Saxon literature. 9. An epic of its kind in an ancient Germanic language. Nowhere else is a traditional theme handled in a long narrative poem, against a background which reveals to us the culture and society of the heroic age of the Germanic peoples. Whether there were in fact other Anglo-Saxon epics, which have not survived, is a question which may well be debated forever, but the fact remains that Beowulf survives in a single manuscript, which was damaged by fire before it was ever studied or transcribed. If it is impossible to determine conclusively whether it was the Anglo-Saxon epic or simply an Anglo-Saxon epic, though it should be mentioned that modern opinion inclines to the belief that it was the only poem of its kind composed in Anglo-Saxon times, it can at least be said that it is a poem technically impressive in its handling of narrative verse, remarkably successful in rendering that combination of heroic idealism and sombre fatalism which seems to have been part of the Germanic temper, yet structurally weak in providing insufficient unity of tone or organization to hold together effectively the two central episodes and the many digressions which make up the whole. Though the ultimate origin of the story is folklore, working, as folklore does, on history, and behind the poem probably lies a variety of popular lays. The poem as we have it is generally agreed to be the work of a single author writing in the first half of the 8th century, though a powerful case has been made out for its having been composed orally by a heathen considerably earlier, with the Christian's references, of which there are about 70, representing later revision or interpolations. Future scholars may well return to this latter view. Beowulf falls into two main parts. The first deals with the visit of Beowulf, nephew of King Hygelac of the Geats. The Geats probably occupied what is now southern Sweden, to the court of King Hrothgar of Denmark. The aging Hrothgar had long been plagued by a man-eating monster, Grendel, who came regularly to the king's great hall of horror to prey on his warriors, and it was to slay the monster that Beowulf came to Denmark. He fights with and mortally wounds Grendel and Horit, and when Grendel's mother comes to take revenge for the death of her son, he follows her to her underwater home and after a desperate struggle slays her too. Beowulf and his companions then leave for home, laden with honours and presents from the Danish king. The second part takes place 50 years later, when Beowulf has long been king of the Geats. A dragon, guarding a hoard of treasure, has been disturbed, and has been going out to wreak slaughter throughout the land. Beowulf, to save his country from the dragon's ravages, undertakes to fight it, and though he succeeds in slaying it, he is himself mortally wounded in the 10. Anglo-Saxon literature. Struggle. The poem ends with an account of Beowulf's funeral. His body is burned on an elaborate funeral pyre, amid the lamentations of his warriors. There are historical elements in Beowulf, though they are seen through the folk memory and the folk imagination, in combination with a variety of marvellous legends. There are also numerous digressions and allusions which make it clear that the author is taking for granted among his readers, or auditors, knowledge of a whole body of stories concerning Germanic heroes. In the feast at Horit celebrating Beowulf's victory over Grendel, we are told how the minstrel recited the story of Inrif's death at the hands of the sons of Finn and the subsequent vengeance taken on Finn by the Danes, whose leader Inrif had been. Part of the Minstrel's recital is given at considerable length in Beowulf, but it cannot have had little meaning to anyone without a knowledge of the whole story. We can in some degree reconstruct the sequence of events with the help of a fragmentary Anglo-Saxon lay, the fight at Finspur, which appears to deal with other events in the same story, told on a different scale. Other stories are referred to in Beowulf more casually, and part of its interest lies in the thread of Germanic story that runs through allusions, analogies, and references through the poem. Though it is an Anglo-Saxon poem, composed in England, it harks back to the period of Germanic history before the Anglo-Saxon invasion and shows no bias toward English heroes. Geats, Danes, and Swedes occupy the foreground of the narrative, and emerging briefly from the background are a number of figures, whom we also meet in Scandinavian tradition and in the poetry and legends of a variety of Teutonic peoples. On the surface, Beowulf is a heroic poem, celebrating the exploits of a great warrior whose character and actions are held up as a model of aristocratic virtue. It reflects the ideals of that state of society we commonly call the heroic age, and its resemblance to the Odyssey in this respect has often been noted. The grave courtesy with which common men of rank are received and dismissed, the generosity of rulers and the loyalty of retainers, the thirst for fame through the achievement of deeds of courage and endurance, the solemn boasting of warriors before and after performance, the interest in genealogies and pride in a noble heredity, all these things are to be found in both poems. But Beowulf is also a record of marvels rather different in kind from those encountered by Ulysses in his adventures, and, further, its Anglo-Saxon gravity is reinforced by the introduction of Christian elements which do not, however, seriously weaken the pagan atmos. Anglo-Saxon Literature. 11. Fear of the poem, for they are concerned with large elemental facts such as God's creation and governance of the world and such Old Testament stories as that of Cain's murder of Abel. If the general atmosphere of Beowulf can be called seriously pagan, with the seriousness deepened and the pagan heroic ideal enlarged by Christian elements, it is certainly not uncivilized, though the civilization it reflects is primitive enough. There is a genuine ideal of nobility underlying its adventure stories. It is the splendid gravity of the poem that falls most impressively on modern ears. Sometimes in a single line the poem conveys atmosphere and mood to perfection. We are given an account of Beowulf's reception at Hornet, and his confident words before his warriors lay themselves down to sleep. Then, kom tilde en monol nat, skrits 3 ants I do 3 en 3, skatens refon, ba pret hornrist, hilbenskolden, il butenanum. De kom of more under mistilde le opum, 3 rendel 30 en 3 an, 30 desi bolr. Came on the dark night, gliding, the shadowy prowler. The warriors slept who were to hold the antlered hall, all but one dot. Then from the moor under the misty cliffs, came Grendel marching. He bore God's anger. The tone is not uniform, but the poem is at its most effective in its moments of slow terror or suspense, and in its more elegiac moods. It has neither the larger epic conception of the _ODYSSEY nor the fine polish of a secondary epic such as the Aeneid. But it is an impressive, if uneven, performance, carrying us successfully into the Anglo-Saxon heroic imagination, with its emphasis on solemn courtesy, generosity, fidelity, and sheer endurance, and underlying all is the sense of the shortness of life and the passing away of all things except the fame a man leaves behind. There is little else surviving of Anglo-Saxon literature which makes direct contact with the older heroic view of life. An interesting poem of 42 lines is the complaint of a minstrel who, after years of service to his lord, has been supplanted by a rival, Horrenda. He comforts himself by recounting the trials of Germanic. 3, like P, has the sound of TB. D is the capital form of 3. 12. Anglo-Saxon Literature. Heroes, all of which were eventually overcome. After each reference to the troubles of some famous character there occurs the refrain President of Eriod, Pissus with reg, that was surmounted, so may this be. We get fascinating glimpses of figures famous in Germanic legend and the Smithley, Theodoric the Ostrogoth, Ormanric the Goth, and others, and of the troubles they suffered or caused. But Tilde's main interest of the poem lies in its combination of this kind of subject matter with a personal, elegiac note. Not common in Anglo-Saxon poetry, though found even more intensely in The Wanderer and The Seafarer, to be discussed later. 2 fragments make up the remainder of what we have of older Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry, and the fact that both were discovered by accident illustrates the arbitrariness as well as the incompleteness of the extant body of Anglo-Saxon verse. The first is a fragment of 50 lines, incomplete both at the beginning and the end, dealing with the same Finn story which we hear of in Beowulf. It is part of a lay, and describes the attack on Henref's hall by the followers of Finn. the Beowulf passage being a paraphrase of a handling at much greater length of the same general subject, though there are difficulties in reconciling it with the fragment. The second fragment is part of an Anglo-Saxon treatment of the Waltharius story, a story well known on the continent and preserved in its most complete form in the Latin epic of Waltharius by Eckhard of St. Gall, who lived in the latter part of the 10th century. The Anglo-Saxon fragment Muhik, though earlier than Eckhard's Waltharius, shows evidence of a Christian editing of which the Latin poem gives little sign, is generally known as Walther. It consists of two separate parts of about 30 lines each, and its chief interest is in offering further evidence of the popularity of stories of continental Germanic heroes among the Anglo-Saxons. The two leaves of manuscript which contain the fragmentary Walther were not discovered until 1860. The Christianizing of the Anglo-Saxons had more far-reaching effects on their literature than the addition of Christian elements to heroic poems. By the 8th century, the techniques of Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry were being applied to purely Christian themes, with the result that we have a substantial body of Anglo-Saxon religious poetry, representing a quite new development in English literature. Here we see the Anglo-Saxons breaking loose from their pagan origins and, instead of seeking subjects for their poetrying the heroic themes common to old Germania, turning to face the new world of Latin Christianity. It is Christianity that brought the Anglo-Saxons, Anglo-Saxon literature, 13, into touch with Christian Europe, and Christian Europe in turn had its contacts with the classical civilization of Greece and Rome. We must thus distinguish between the part of Anglo-Saxon literature which sought nourishment from barbarian, Germanic traditions that had nothing to do with classical civilization, and the part whose inspiration is Latin and which represents an English treatment of themes and attitudes common throughout Christendom and thus found all over Europe. The Christian literature of the early English shows them in touch with the new European civilization as well as with the ancient classical world. It also enabled Anglo-Saxon poets to work on biblical story and so connected them with the Hebrew imagination. Religious poetry seems to have flourished in northern England and Northumbria throughout the 8th century, though most of it has survived only in West Saxon transcriptions of the late 10th century. Bede, the great English ecclesiastical historian and scholar who lived from 673 to 735, tells in his ecclesiastical history of the English people how in the monastery of the abbess Hilda would be a lowly lay brother named Credman suddenly and miraculously received the gift of song and, at once, began to sing in praise of God the Creator verses which he had never heard before. As the abbess Hilda died in 680, this puts the beginnings of Anglo-Saxon religious poetry before that date. The only poem we have which is certainly by Credman is the 9-line poem quoted by Bede in his account of the poet's first inspiration. Bede wrote his ecclesiastical history in Latin, though it was translated into Anglo-Saxon under King Alfred, but fortunately in one of the manuscripts of the work the original Northumbrian text of the poem has been preserved. No Silenhergen, Hifamara Grasuard, Matudsis Mrekti and his Modja Dank. Uar Calderfitter, Suhi Undergehers. Essie Drigton, or Asteledra. Now let us praise the guardian of heaven's kingdom, the Creator's might and his purpose, the work of the Father of glory, as he of all wonders, eternal Lord, established the beginning. The difference between Northumbrian and West Saxon can be seen at a glance if we put beside the Northumbrian version, quoted above, the following later West Saxon version. No school in Herrigen Heavenrus is weird. Meo toads may halond his modgebank. 14. Anglo-Saxon literature. War /Volderfrider, Swihi Wondrajo ::st. Estraton or onstilt. This shows, clearly enough, the vocabulary of praise which the earlier Scop had applied to his Lord now being applied to God, and gives some indication of how the heroic style could be adapted to biblical subjects. Bede tells Ennis that Credman went on to sing about the creation of the world and the origin of mankind and the whole story of Genesis, about the exodus of Israel from Egypt and their entrance into the Promised Land, about many other stories from Holy Writ, about the incarnation, passion, and ascension into heaven of the Lord, about the coming of the Holy Ghost and the teaching of the apostles. There are Anglo-Saxon poems on many of these subjects, and for a long time these were held to be credments. But the relative stiffness of the 9 lines quoted by Bede seems to represent an earlier stage in the development of Anglo-Saxon religious poetry than that represented by such poems as Genesis, Exodus, and Daniel, which show greater variety and ease of movement. Though it is true that 9 lines do not give much basis for comparison, and the poems once attributed to Credman are now thought to be later in date, though still regarded as belonging to the Credmonian school. The Junius manuscript contains 4 Credmonian poems, of which the first 3 are based on Old Testament story. The first, and the longest, of these is Genesis, a poem of nearly 3,000 lines which, after a brief preliminary account of Satan's rebellion, God's anger, his casting out of Satan and his crew, and his decision to establish again the glorious creation, when his boastful foes had departed from heaven on high, goes on to narrate the substance of the first 22 chapters of Genesis. The manuscript is imperfect and there are several gaps in the text. There is also a remarkable interpolation of over 600 lines, different in language and style from the body of the poem and clearly coming from another work. This interpolated passage, generally known as Genesis B, to distinguish it from the rest of the poem, known as Genesis A, deals with the temptation of Adam and Eve and their fall and, in considerable detail, with Satan's rebellion, which is so much more breedy, dealt with in the introduction to Genesis A. The poetic vigour and dramatic detail of Genesis B is remarkable. The poem is a rudimentary paradise lost and, indeed, its finest passages can bear comparison with parts of Milton's epic. Satan's first speech, "Why should I toil? I need of no master. I can work as many wonders with my hands. Why should I wait upon his favour, bow before him with such homage? I can be God as well as he. Has tremendous if primi. See above, p. 6.1 Note 1. Anglo-Saxon Literature. 15. To verve. While his second and longer speech, made after he has been cast into hell, has something of the true Miltonic ring, had I but the strength of my hands and could for 1 hour win out of here, for 1 winter hour, then I with this host I, but around me lay iron bonds, the fetter's chain rides on me. I look not to behold that light again which he thinks long to enjoy, that happiness /with his host of angels, we shall never gain, softening of Almighty God's anger, let us take it from the sons of men, that heavenly kingdom, now that we may not have it dealt lead them to forsake his allegiance, to transgress what he bade them with his word. Satan's rhetoric in Genesis B is the primitive rhetoric of the heroic age compared with the subtler parliamentary rhetoric of Milton's Satan. But there is real poetic imagination at work here, an ability to give vigorous new life to a traditional character. The story of the fall of Satan is not, of course, in the biblical Genesis, but it had long been part of Christian tradition. The original author of Genesis B was not English, but wrote in Old Saxon on the continent. The Anglo-Saxon poem which we have is a translation of an Old Saxon original, of which only portions have been found. Genesis A, which is far the larger work, lacks the higher imaginative quality of Genesis B, but the versification shows a fine technical ease, and the adaptation of the conventions of heroic poetry to biblical narrative is done with real skill. Its source is essentially Jerome's standard Latin translation of the Bible, known as the Vulgate, but the author has drawn also on patristic commentary and Christian legend. He must, therefore, have been a clerk, a churchman of some kind, for no one else could at that period have had the requisite education. It was probably written in Northumbria early in the 8th century. Genesis B cannot be earlier than its Old Saxon original, which dates from the 9th century, as the Junius manuscript, in which the poem is found, dates from the late 10th or early 11th century. The poem as we have it in Anglo-Saxon must have been produced between the end of the 9th and the end of the 10th centuries. The adaptation to religious verse of the style and conventions of heroic poetry is even more vividly demonstrated in the Anglo-Saxon Exodus. The scriptural narrative is followed less closely than in Genesis A. Moses emerges as the glorious hero leading a warlike. 16. Anglo-Saxon Literature. people to freedom and victory. The description of the drowning of the Egyptian host in the Red Sea is done with great verve. Stream is stoden, storm up gewat, he to hevenum, heru upem rest, lal 5 easiermden, ift up guesswork, f gum stefnum, hod blod gewad, ran birigren rofin, roder swipod, meridashim rest, modich swalton, dot sending is on called 5 re, air switlow road, shresret end. The seas reared up, the stun uprose, hiked to the heavens, the great clamour of an army, the foe cried out, the air above grew dark, with doomed voices, blood spread through the waters. The wall of shields was pulled down, scorched the sky, the greatest of water deaths, brave men perished, kings in their pride, their chance of return vanished. At the sea's end. Linguistic evidence suggests that Exodus is the oldest of the Anglo-Saxon biblical poems, and it perhaps dates from the beginning of the 8th century. Daniel is less interesting, with much less dramatic quality and a more prosaic tone throughout. It is a paraphrase of the first 5 chapters of the biblical book of Daniel as it appears in the Vulgate, with the apocryphal prayer of Isaiah interpolated in the middle. The interpolation seems to derive from a separate poem dating from the middle or late 9th century. The main part of Daniel was probably composed in Northumbria early in the 8th century. In the same manuscript that contains the 2 Genesis poems, Exodus and Daniel, there is found also an untitled religious poem which is now generally called Christ and Satan. This shows an Anglo-Saxon poet working not directly from biblical sources but from a variety of Christian traditions. Here we get a picture of Satan in hell, which represents him not as the defiant spirit of Genesis B but as a lost soul lamenting bitterly his exclusion from the joys of heaven. He is given several speeches, each with considerable elegiac eloquence. The author is clearly concerned to emphasize the difference between heaven and hell and the different results of following Christ and following Satan. The latter part of the poem concentrates on Christ, though at the very end, after an account of Satan's temptation of Christ in the wilderness, we return to Satan in his frustration. Christ and Satan seems to have been influenced by the school of Wolffe, a poet who may have flourished early in the 9th century and who is the first Anglo-Saxon poet to sign his work by means of Anglo-Saxon Literature. 17. Runic letters woven into the poem. 4 of Wolffe's poems are extant, all showing a more self-conscious craftsmanship than is found in the Cædmonian poems and suggesting in style and structure the influence of classical models. The heroic strain, so successfully transplanted from the older poetry in such a poem as Exodus, is lacking in Wolffe, and in its place we find a more meditative and contemplative tone. The 4 Anglo-Saxon Christian poems which have the name of Wolffe worked into them in acrostic form are Christ, Juliana, Eileen, and the Fates of the Apostles. All these poems possess both a high degree of literary craftsmanship and a note of mystical contemplation which sometimes rises to a high level of religious passion. The story of Christ is told in the poem of that title draws on a variety of ecclesiastical and patristic sources, but it handles its subject, the Advent, the Ascension, and the last Changement with an intensity all its own. The dialogue between Mary and Joseph in the first part, brief though it is, shows a real feeling for the dramatic situation, and is, besides, the earliest extant dramatic passage in English literature. Juliana is a more conventional work, a typical saint's life, following its Latin prose source without any significant deviation, while Eileen is the story of the discovery of the true cross by Saint Helena, mother of Constantine, told with a keen sense of the wonder of it all and a relish for the romantic suggestions of distant scenes and places. The Fates of the Apostles is a short poem of 122 lines, and may be the concluding part of Andreas, which it follows in the manuscript. If so, then Andreas, too, is by Wolffe, for the Fates of the Apostles contains the runic signature. The author is here meditating on the adventures of the various apostles after they dispersed to spread the gospel, but its interest for the modern reader lies largely in the personal passages. Its opening shows an interesting mutation of the heroic into the personal. Elegiac strain. Lo, weary of wandering, sad in spirit, I made this song, gathered it from far and wide, of how the bright and glorious heroes showed forth their courage. With Saxon religious poetry moves beyond biblical paraphrase into the didactic, the devotional, and the mystical. These qualities are also exhibited by many of the religious poems which seem to have been written under his influence. The most remarkable of these is the Dream of the Rood, fragments of which are to be found inscribed in runic letters on the Ruthwell cross in Untitled. Some scholars maintain that only the second part, to which they give the title of the $1 Lawn, or Christ be, is by Beowulf, for only this part contains Beowulf's name in runic characters. The other two parts they consider to be separate poems, giving one the tide of the Advent, or Nativity, or Christ Day, and the other the title of Do One's Day, or Christ See, grouping it together with two other poems on the Last Judgment which they call De less than JM and De and Doomsday Be respectively. 18. Anglo-Saxon Literature. Freeside, Scotland, probably an early 8th century version, pre-Beowulf, while the complete poem exists in the Exeter Book, in a much later version, probably late 9th century. The tone of the complete version as we have it suggests that the earlier version had been afterward adapted by a poet of the Estild Hill of Beowulf, perhaps even by Beowulf himself. It is the oldest surviving English poem in the form of a dream or vision, a form which was later to be used for such a variety of purposes. The dreamer tells how he saw a vision of the bright cross, brilliantly adorned with gems, and goes on to tell the speech that he heard it utter, the speech of the cross, in which it tells of its origin in the forest, its removal to be made into a cross for the master of mankind, its horror at the role it had to play but its determination to stand fast because that was God's command, the suffering of the young hero who ascends the cross resolutely in order to redeem mankind. All this is done in verse charged with a simple eloquence and sustaining a high note of religious passion and wonder. The speech ends with an exhortation to each soul to seek through the cross the kingdom which is far from earth, and the poem then concludes with the dreamer's account of his own religious hopes. Other poems associated with the school of Beowulf are Andrea's, which tells of the adventures, sufferings, and evangelical successes of St. Andrew, with deliberate emphasis on the wonderful and the picturesque, and a perhaps excessive exploitation of the rhetorical devices of Anglo-Saxon poetry. The source of the poem is a Latin rendering of the apocryphal Greek Acts of Andrew and Matthew, to poems on the life of the English hermit St. Guthlac, the Phoenix, of which the first part, deriving from the Latin poem De Eva Innis, attributed to Lactantius, describes an earthly paradise in the east, the beauty of the phoenix, its flight to Syria after it has lived for 1,000 years to build its nest, die, and be reborn, while the second half takes the phoenix as an allegory both of the life of the virtuous in this world and the next, and as a symbol of Christ, and following the phoenix in the Exeter Book, a poem entitled Theologus or Bestiarii, which belongs to the popular medieval literary form of beast allegories, where real or, more often, imaginary qualities of animals are given a moral application. Theologus, which derives ultimately from a Greek original, is incomplete, and deals with the panther, the whale and, incompletely, the partridge. It has the same lushness of descriptive style that is found in the phoenix, and its natural history is equally fabulous. The whale is given the charming name of Fastitokel in a corruption of Aspidochlone, originally applied to the turtle. Anglo-Saxon Literature. 19. Finally, there falls to be mentioned among significant Anglo-Saxon religious poems the fragmentary Ludith, of which only the concluding sections survive, in the same manuscript that contains Beowulf. The poem is a version of the Vulgate text of the apocryphal Book of Judith, and the extant portion tells in vigorous and rapidly moving verse of Judith's beheading of the drunken Helaimes after his confident feasting, her rallying of the Hebrews to attack the Assyrians, the consternation of the Assyrians on discovering Holofernes' headless body, the rout of the Assyrians by the Hebrews, and Judith's triumph and praise to God. 1 Judith possesses a fierce energy in describing the death of Holofernes and the defeat of the Assyrians, a note of positive jubilation, which is quite different from anything in the older heroic poetry. In fluidity of movement, the verse form shows itself to be fairly late, and the poem may date from the end of the 9th century or possibly even later. Though some of the Anglo-Saxon religious poems, especially some of those by Cynewulf and his school, express a personal devotional feeling, none of them can be said to be really lyrical, in character, or to have been written primarily for the purpose of exploring personal emotion. Neither the heroic nor the religious poetry of the Anglo-Saxon tends toward the lyric, and though a note of sombre elegy is sometimes struck, it is rarely developed for its own sake. There is, however, a group of Anglo-Saxon poems in which a mood of lyrical elegy predominates, and these stand somewhat apart from the poetry we have already discussed. Of these, the Wanderer and the Seafarer are the most similar to each other. The Wanderer is the lament, if rem nwh ih linspinach pi in the comma etk, if loved Lord, but who now, long after his Lord's death and the passing away of that earlier time of happiness and friendship, has become a wanderer journeying the paths of exile across the ICC. The poem ends with some conventional moralizing, but the main part of the elegy is an impressive lament for departed joys, done with a plangent tone of reminiscence and an effective use of the ubisant theme. Where are the snows of yesteryear? That was to become such a favourite in medieval literature. The Seafarer, which has the same melancholy tone, the same mingling of regret and self-pity, is the monologue of an old sailor who recalls the loneliness and hardships of a life at sea while at the same time aware of its fascination. Some critics take it to be a dialogue, in which the old sailor urges the hardships of the seafaring life against the arguments of an eager young man anxious to take to the sea and attracted by the difficulties, and the poem can indeed be read in this way, but the Huck minus 20. Anglo-Saxon Literature. Two eating moods of the poem seem more impressive if taken as the alternation of weariness and fascination in the same person. Whichever way we read it, however, it is the elegiac element that stands out from among the sometimes obscure stilled quints, tilled moods, which ends, like the Wanderer, with a conventional reckless sentiment. The date of both these poems is uncertain. They may be almost as old as Beowulf. Both are found in the Exeter Book. Another poem in the Exeter Book, which is generally given the title of the Wife's Lament, can also be considered as belonging to this group of elegiac monologues. It is difficult to follow the precise situation the speaker is describing, but apparently the wife has been separated from her husband and forced to dwell in a cave in the forest by the plottings of his kinsmen. In spite of the comparative obscurity of the situation, the central emotion comes through strongly, and the note of personal passion, the love and longing for the absent husband, the curse on the enemy responsible for her present plight, rings out with remarkable clarity. Similar in many ways to this poem is the husband's message. Here the speaker is the piece of wood on which the letter is carved. It first tells the wife its own life story and then goes on to speak the message now carved on it. The husband reminds the wife of her earlier vows, tells her that he has been driven from her by a feud, and bids her join him across the sea. Willful Adversaries is another dramatic monologue, existing only in a fragment of 19 lines in the Exeter Book, which, for all the obscurity of the situation described, expresses an intense romantic passion in a way quite uncharacteristic of Anglo-Saxon poetry as it has come down to us. Wolf is the woman's outlawed lover and Edwis her hated husband, or at least the man with whom, against her will, she is forced to live. The passionate cry of Wolf, min woof, weena pine, see os jediden, pine seld seamas, mern en mod, nails me tellest. Wolf, my longings for thee have made me sick. Thy rare visits, it was my sorrowful heart, not want of food, might be a shield calling for Tristan as conceived by some 19th century romantic poet. The wife's lament, the husband's message, and Wilf and Edwis represent all we have of Anglo-Saxon love poetry. They have not been tampered with by clerics anxious to give a moral and religious twist to the end, but have survived in all the Anglo-Saxon literature. 21. Intensity of their original utterance. How many poems in a similar style may have been lost it is impossible to tell, nor is it easy to say for what kind of an audience this kind of poetry was written. We know to what taste the Anglo-Saxon heroic poet catered, and we can understand the appeal of the religion's poetry of the age, but these passionate renderings of personal emotion, devoid of either heroic atmosphere or religious teaching, must have appealed to a taste one is not accustomed to thinking of as at all prevalent in the Anglo-Saxon period of English culture. There is one other interesting Anglo-Saxon poem with an elegiac tone. It is a description of a ruined city, perhaps Bath, in about 50 lines, found in the Exeter Book. It is a sad picture of desolation and decay set against an account of the earlier prosperity of the place, and, though the text is imperfect, the sense of passionate regret at the passing away of what was once lively and beautiful is conveyed with impressive eloquence. No clerical improver has tagged a religious moral onto it, or, if he has, it has not survived in the incomplete version which alone is extant, and the mood is somberly fatalistic. The ruin is not incompatible in feeling with much of Beowulf, which has its own stern sense of fate, and we can see from it how in Anglo-Saxon poetry one kind of elegiac mood was the reverse of the medal whose obverse was heroic. The Exeter Book contains nearly 100 Anglo-Saxon riddles, some of which seem to have been translated from Latin originals composed in England by clerics of the 7th and 8th century and some derived from the 4th to 5th century Latin writer Symphosius. This form of literary amusement has little appeal for the modern reader, though many of the riddles which are in regular Anglo-Saxon verse form show considerable literary skill, particularly in descriptive passages. Their chief interest today lies in the incidental glimpses they give us of the daily life of Anglo-Saxon England and the folk beliefs of the time. Similarly, the so-called gnomic verses, some of which are also in the Exeter Book, and some in a British Museum manuscript, with their generalizations about morals and experience and the properties of objects encountered in daily living, are of interest to the social historian as the only group of existing Anglo-Saxon poems which are not on the whole aristocratic in origin. They rehearse the manners and opinions of the peasantry of the period. Toward the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, the old heroic note, so long unheard, re-emerges finally in two poems dealing with contemporary history. The Battle of Brunanburh appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle under the date 937. It celebrates the victory of 22 Anglo-Saxon Literature, Aethelstan of Wessex and Edmund, his brother, against the combined forces of Olaf the Norseman, Constantine, King of Scots, and the Britons of Strathclyde. There is an important difference, however, between the heroic tone of this poem and that of the older Anglo-Saxon poetry. In the older heroic poetry, emphasis was laid on the individual hero, and his national origins were of little importance. He was one of the heroes of Germania and as such claimed the admiration of all the Germanic peoples without any national prejudice. But the Battle of Brunanburh shows strong patriotic sentiment. The victory is regarded as a victory of the English forces against Norse, Scots, and Welsh enemies, and though the heroism of Aethelstan and Edmund is celebrated, the two princes appear not as heroes in their own right so much as champions of their nation. The Battle of Malvern appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle under the date 991. It deals in the older epic manner with one of the many clashes between English and Danes that resulted from the latter's attacks in England, which culminated in the conquest of the country by Canute, in 1012. The older heroic poems did not, of course, deal with historical events that had only just occurred, nor, as we have noted, did they show any trace of national patriotic feeling. Yet the Battle of Malvern is remarkably similar in spirit to the older heroic poetry. It is the story of a disastrous English Beowulf, Beowulf, ealdorman of Essex, who led the English forces, and died in a recklessly courageous attempt to stem the Danes. The poem contains 9 speeches, mostly of exhortation and encouragement to the English forces, delivered by 7 clever speakers. Many of the English warriors are mentioned by name, though not one of the Danes is so singled out. The passionate loyalty of retainers to their chief is eloquently presented, and the tone of desperate courage against hopeless odds becomes more and more intense as the poem proceeds, to culminate after the death of Beowulf in the final words of his old retainer Beowulf. Hitchskill P. Hirdre, Hort P. Senner, Mod Seal P. Mir, P. Urim Regan Lit Lab, Hurley, Urielder Ilforhain, God an Griot, Regnornian, Seti nu frampis weg pliegen wenden pen seti, Ian fraudfoers, Framikne will, Akik me be healf minum Hilford, be swayofen men, began pence. Thought shall be the harder, heart the keener, courage shall be the more, as our might lessons. Anglo-Saxon Literature. 23. Here lies our Lord, all hewn down, the good man in the dust, ever may he lament. Who now from this war play thinks to come? I am old in years, from here I will not go, but I by the side of my Lord, by the man so dear, purpose to lie. And, in this high strain, Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry comes to an end. The Anglo-Saxon innovators of Britain brought with them their own poetry, but there is no evidence of their having possessed any literary prose tradition. The development of Old English prose does not, therefore, go back to earlier Germanic origins, as the poetry does. It takes place wholly in England, and largely as a result of the Christianization of England. It is not surprising that prose developed later than poetry. That is the normal thing in the history of any literature, for the primal urge to artistic expression is bound to be poetic, while the proper maturing of the more utilitarian prose medium of communication follows the emergence of later political and cultural needs. With the Germanic peoples, the delay in the development of prose was emphasized by their contact with the old and mature Greco-Roman civilization, which supplied clerks ready to act as secretaries to their leaders, and a sophisticated Greek or Latin prose more than capable of making any formal communications or keeping any legal or historical records which might be required. For the celeb exclamation of the own hero and the liluation of the own legends, a native poetry was necessary and indeed inevitable. But the need for prose was only felt by barbarian chieftains after they had come into contact and had been deeply affected by the civilization they threatened, and the civilization could easily supply the need of which it made them aware. There were exceptions to this generalization, but there can be little doubt that it applies to the Anglo-Saxons, or that English prose begins in the reign of King Alfred in an attempt by the king and his associates to bring within range of the people the most significant aspects of earlier thought. Latin was, of course, the language of the Christian Church, and an essential tool in clerical education. Perhaps if England had been geographically closer to Rome, Latin might have stifled a native prose altogether, just as its prestige and availability had earlier hampered the development of a formal native prose among many of the Germanic peoples. But, as one of the most perceptive historians of early English prose has put it, when Gregory the Great sent his missionaries to England, Latin civilization reached a land which was so remote from Rome that Latin, ch.e.l. J. 24, Anglo-Saxon literature, could influence the native language without depressing it, and when the laws of Kent were amended to introduce new Christian notions, the new clauses were written not in Latin but in English. King Alfred of Wessex, known in political history for his achievement in stemming the Danish conquest of England, the acceptance of his overlordship by, in the words of the Anglo-Saxon CHRONICLEALL, the English people accept those who were under the power of the Danes, and the consequent advance of the peoples of the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms toward an awareness of their political unity as Englishmen, and for his remarkable combination of the statesman, the military strategist, and the patriot, is even more important in the history of English education and the history of English literature. Throughout a reign troubled by military problems of desperate urgency, not all of which had been resolved by the time of his death in 899, he yet found the time and the energy to meditate on the means of bringing the fruits of Western culture to all the free-born young men of England, and to see those means in large measure achieved. In his preface to his translation of the Cura Pastoralis, Pastoris/Care, of Pope Gregory the Great, he tells of his concern at the dearth of scholars in England at the time of his accession to the throne, in 871, and at the destruction of churches and books by the Danes, and his wonder why earlier English scholars had not translated any of those books into the vernacular. Then he immediately proceeds to answer the last question by saying that those Earlier scholars could never have supposed that a knowledge of the original languages should have declined to such a degree. But he realized that Christian culture had its roots in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin sources, and that if these were to be made available to the people, an ambitious program of translation into the vernacular would have to be undertaken. When I remembered how Latin learning has already decayed throughout England, though many can read English writing, I began, among many other varied and manifold cares of this kingdom, to translate into English the book which is called in Latin Pastoralis and in English Herd Book, Herd's Book, i.e., Shepherd's Book, Pastoral. Alfred's program of translation did not include direct translations from the original sources of Christian culture, but concentrated on later Latin works in which, as he believed, much of the ancient wisdom was distilled. Thus Gregory's Cura Pastoralis, a work describing the duties and responsibilities of a bishop which had come to be 6 R.W. Champion, the continuity of English prose, in Harpsfield's Life of S.F.F. Thomas More, edited by Elsie Vaughan Hitchcock and R.W. Chambers, London, 1932, page Licks. Anglo-Saxon Literature. 25. Regarded as a manual of a parish priest's duties, came first on his list. He must have been attracted by Gregory's emphasis on the bishop's duty to teach the laity. Alfred was especially concerned with the training of teachers who would all, of course, be clerics, and whose teaching would be religious, as his choice of this work indicates. All the free-born English youth should be able to read English, and those who wished to proceed to the priesthood would, after learning English, go on to Latin. English was necessary as a first step both for priest and layman. The translation of the Cura Pastoralis was done by Alfred with the assistance of scholars who explained the meaning to him, sometimes word by word, sometimes sense by sense. For Alfred was late in learning Latin and depended on a number of helpers, of whom 7 are known to us by name. It is on the whole a literal rendering, but it housed easily, and there is little indication of the forcing of one language into the idiom of another, such as we might expect in a pioneer translation. Alfred's next work was a translation of the Hist. 01ie Adversum Paganos of the 5th century Latin writer Paulus Orosius, a work written under the influence of St. Augustine in order to prove that the introduction of Christianity had not made the world worse than it had been before. Orosius chronicles the calamities of mankind from the fall of man to the fall of Rome with an equal disregard for historical accuracy and literary grace, and it is a pity that this shoddy production was the only world history available to Alfred. Fortunately, Alfred treated his original rather freely, adding his own illustrations and omitting much propaganda. More important, he added 2 entirely new narratives, one told him by Oliver, a Norwegian who had explored from his home within the Arctic Circle, sailing round the North Cape as far as the White Sea. The other told him by a voyager named Wulfstan who had sailed the Baltic from Schleswig to the mouth of the Vistula. These lively accounts of foreign lands and peoples, together with Alfred's additions to Orosius drawn from his own knowledge and experience, give this translation its present value. The voyages of Oler and Wulfstan are justly celebrated as among the high spots of Anglo-Saxon prose, and the prose is certainly Alfred's own. The translation of Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica, Ecclesiastical History of the English People, associated with Alfred's name, is a literal rendering of the Latin, perhaps not done by Alfred himself, though certainly inspired by him. Alfred's 2 final translations were of more philosophical works. That of the De Consolatione Philosophiae, the Consolation of Philosophy, of Boethius, a Roman philosopher and statesman of the late 5th and early 6th centuries, made avail. 26. Anglo-Saxon Literature. Able in Anglo-Saxon, one of the most popular philosophical works of the Dark and Middle Ages, later translated by Chaucer. It deals, in the form of a dialogue between the author and philosophy, with the fundamental problems of God's government of the world, the nature of true happiness, good and evil, and the question of God's foreknowledge of man's free will, though there is no specific reference to Christianity anywhere in the work, and the general tone of the work derives from Greek and Roman ethical thought rather than from Christian teaching. Its high idealism and, in particular, its reconciliation of God's perfection with the apparently imperfect state of his world, appeal to Christian thought. To the 18th century Gibbon, such topics of consolation, so obvious, so vague, or so abstruse, are ineffectual to subdue the feelings of human nature, but the medieval mind found them more helpful. Alfred in his later years had left history and geography to meditate on profounder philosophical themes, and the work of Boethius-Schuon in prison while the author was awaiting execution had a particular appeal to a man and to an age familiar with sudden reversals of fortune and anxious to find a wider and a keener perspective from which to contemplate human vicissitudes. Alfred's last work was a book of blossoms, derived for the most part from the colloquies of St. Augustine, but with freely interspersed original comments and illustrations. In his preface, Alfred compares himself and his literary endeavours to a man collecting wood in a vast forest which contains plenty of materials for all kinds of building. The analogy is apt enough, and expressed in a fine piece of Anglo-Saxon prose, it can serve as a summing up of Alfred's literary purposes. Alfred's laws, though of great importance to the political historian, must, like the laws of other Anglo-Saxon kings, and like Anglo-Saxon charters and similar non-literary prose works, remain outside the purview of the historian of literature, even though they, like the charters, have considerable interest for the student of the development of English prose. The laws, however, are effaced by a translation of chapters 20 to 23 of Exodus, which tell of the giving of the law to Moses, including the 10 Commandments and other civil and criminal laws, followed by the passage from the 15th chapter of Acts describing the enactment of the Council of Jerusalem and the relation of the Mosaic Law to the New Dispensation, which represent the earliest extant English biblical translations except for some literal renderings of the Psalms. Bede, who died in 735, was said to have translated the Gospel of 51, John from Latin into English, and probably did translate the first 6 chapters, but the work has not survived. Anglo-Saxon Literature. 27. It was probably in King Alfred's time that the Great Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was begun, a series of annals which commence with an outline of English history from Julius Caesar's invasion to the middle of the 5th century and continues, in one of its 7 manuscripts, to 1154, retailed afferent tilde as tilde pts, ho tilde which was kept, and continued at a different locality, diverged considerably after the beginning of the 10th century, often including material of especial local interest. The chronicle includes some fine examples of prose narrative, one of the most notable being the story of Cynewulf and Cyneherd, occurring under the surprisingly early date of 755, which shows that at least one English writer of the middle of the 8th century had at his command a prose style comparable to that of the Icelandic prose sagas. The continuity of English prose from the Old English, or Anglo-Saxon, period to the Middle English period is demonstrated by the chronicle more clearly than anywhere else, and its different manuscripts are of prime importance for the student of the English language. The level is far from consistent, dropping considerably in the middle of the 10th century, which is surprising, for that was a period of stability and prosperity, and tearing up into some vivid descriptions at the end of the 10th and the beginning of the 11th centuries, when the second great wave of Danish invasions was tearing the country apart. The manuscript known as D gives a full and lively picture of the relations between England and Scandinavia in the reign of Edward the Confessor, 104 and 66, and a most important account of the Norman invasion and subsequent events, while another manuscript, C, which ends in 1066, gives a vivid account of the conflicts with the Danes in the reign of Ethelred the Unready, 978-1016. The latest entry is in a manuscript that was continued at Peterborough. It is for the year 1154. By this time the English language had developed from the stage we call Anglo-Saxon or Old English into Middle English. By this time, too, as a result of the Norman Conquest and what followed, English as a literary language seemed about to disappear and English historical prose appeared to have come to an end. Until well into the 14th century, English, replaced at court by Norman French since 1066, seemed to be dwindling away into the rustic speech of a handful of uplandish men. But, as we shall see, the tradition did not wholly dry up. It was to emerge again triumphant 300 years after the conquest. The English language eventually conquered the language of the Norman conquerors, and English prose rose to new life in the 15th century. Alfred and the writers who kept up the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle were not the only writers of Anglo-Saxon prose. Alfred's associates, 28, Anglo-Saxon Literature, were also responsible for translations, and we know that Bishop Burforth of Worcester translated the dialogues of Gregory the Great. The most notable of all Anglo-Saxon writers was Leofric, Abbot of Aynsham, the great English scholar of the Benedictine Reformation of the 10th century, whose sermons in the vernacular, the first two series known as the Catholic Homilies, Homilia Catholici, and the third as Lives of the Saints Passionis Sanctumta, their subject matter is not as clearly distinguished as these titles would suggest, with their careful balance and prose rhythm display a fine virtuosity. Leofric also produced a somewhat abbreviated version in Anglo-Saxon of the first 7 books of the Old Testament, the Heptateuch, done with sufficient skill to enable us to call him the first English Bible translator to have gone a considerable way toward achieving an appropriate literary prose style for biblical translation. Beside the carefully balanced sentences of Leofric, we can set the more fiery eloquence of his contemporary, Wulfstan, Archbishop of York from 1002 to 1023. His famous sermon to the English, entitled in the manuscript Sermo Lupi ad Anglos, was delivered in 1014. In it Wulfstan paints a vivid picture of the horrors brought about by the Danish invasions, a picture of wrongdoing, betrayal, violence, crop failures, civil war, treachery, murder, immorality of every kind, and uses it as a means of hammering home to his audience the necessity of amendment if they are to avoid hellfire and earn the glory and the joy that God has prepared for those that do his will on earth. A desperate sense of the imminence of doomsday pervades the whole sermon, from the opening statement, "But this world is in haste and approaches its end," to the powerful "God help us" of the conclusion. Wulfstan's prose, though he, like Leofric, uses alliteration and antithesis, gives an impression of breathless passion, of eloquence breaking out through its own force, which is markedly different from Leofric's finely chiselled urbanity. The ravages of the Danes at the end of the 9th century had wrought havoc with the organisation of the English Church, and, while Alfred's translations represented a remarkable attempt to improve the state of education, it was not until the middle and latter part of the 10th century that a real revival of religious learning took place in England. That revival was the work of the great churchman Dunstan, who, after a life devoted to monastic reform, was translated to the See of Canterbury in 960, of Oswald of Worcester and Lethelwold of Winchester, who carried further the monastic revival begun by Dunstan, of Lethelwold's pupil Elfric, who led the literary movement, and of Archbishop Wulfstan, Leofric's friend, for whom he wrote some of his famous pastoral letters. Leofric and Wulfstan, Anglo-Saxon Literature, 29. Extended the range of effective Anglo-Saxon prose. It was not because they or any ecclesiastic of the time were primarily interested in vernacular literature, but rather because the vitality of the movement of which they were a part carried over into this field. To a 10th century cleric, Latin was the language of learning and of literature, and concessions to the unlearned in the form of translations were achievements of minor importance. The main thing was to keep up the standard of Latin scholarship among the clergy. The most popular of Leofric's works with the modern reader is a set of simple Latin dialogues, the Colloquy, intended to teach Latin to boys in a monastic school. These dialogues, between the teacher and a monk, the teacher and a ploughman, the teacher and a shepherd, the teacher and a fisherman, etc., interest us today because of the lively glimpses they give us of the daily life of the time. But for Leofric they were means to a very important end. Leofric's Colloquy reminds us that with the triumph of Christianity all culture was ecclesiastical culture, and all ecclesiastical culture was based on Latin. The Latin literature of the Anglo-Saxon period is much greater in bulk than that written in the vernacular, and the history of Anglo-Saxon learning is more extensive and in many ways more remarkable than the history of Anglo-Saxon literature. the story of the conversion of England and the development of its ecclesiastical institutions from the landing of Augustine in Kent in 597 through the Synod of Whitby to the 10th century Reformation, which includes the story of English Latin culture, the art of illuminating manuscripts and of handwriting and, indeed, all the other arts, including architecture, is a rich and noble one. It would include the names of Aldhelm, perhaps the most learned man of his day in Europe, of Boniface, who lacked Aldhelm's over-elaboration of style but whose Latin writings have their own individual power and charm, of Benedict, Bishop of Northumbria, who founded the two famous Benedictine monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow, and of Bede, 673-735, Bishop's great pupil, who spent his life as a monk at Jarrow and is one of the really great scholars of England and of Europe, author of numerous works of biblical interpretation, history, biography, and science, of Alkin of York, 735-804, who ended his career as advisor to Charlemagne and head of his palace school, thus playing an important part in the European cultural movement known as the Carolingian Renaissance, as well as of the 10th century writers who have been already discussed. It would include the story of the relations between scholars who looked to Ireland and those who looked to Rome, and the special contributions of each, and it would tell of the part played by English church minus 30. Anglo-Saxon literature. Men as missionaries in Frisia and Germany and Scandinavia. All this is important, because it emphasizes the role of the clerics in carrying on the cultural tradition in this period. Yet it is not strictly a part of the history of English literature. Literature as such, even in Latin, did not yet play the central part in embodying and transmitting the cultural tradition that it was to do later, particularly from the Renaissance on. The man of culture belonged first of all to the Church, and the impressive claims of secular literature had not yet begun to be asserted. Chapter TWO. The development of Middle English prose and verse. T.B. Norman Conquest of England in 1066 provides one of those convenient landmarks for the historian, whether political, social, or cultural, that divide up his subject almost too neatly. The temptation to take Law 66 as the dividing line between the old Anglo-Saxon England and the new Anglo-Norman England is indeed difficult to resist, and of course it should not be altogether resisted. The Norman Conquest imposed a French-speaking ruling caste on England, with the result that Anglo-French developed as the literary language of the highest social classes in Anglo-Saxon, now rapidly developing into the stage of the English language known as Middle English, was for a period relegated to the lower classes. English, which remained the language of the vast majority of the people, eventually won out over French, and by the beginning of the 14th century its victory was clearly evident. But its re-establishment as a polite literary language after the period of Anglo-French ascendancy did not mean that it was starting altogether anew, without awareness of its Anglo-Saxon roots. The English which finally ousted French as the language of the literature of England was a language changed in many important respects. It had lost the Anglo-Saxon inflections and had greatly enriched its vocabulary from French, but it had not wholly lost touch with its traditions, and there is a greater continuity between Anglo-Saxon and Middle English literature than the casual reader of both might imagine. It is true that in English poetry the rhymed verse of French soon replaced the Anglo-Saxon alliterative tradition, though there was a remarkable revival of told alliterative verse in the 14th century, and the English tradition 3 prose, which, after the achievements of the Alfredian translators and the homiletic tradition of Pangloffric and Wulfstan, was much more 32 Middle English prose and verse, advanced than anything in French prose, did not prevent French influence from making verse the medium of much Middle English historical and miscellaneous writing for which prose would have been, and, in the Anglo-Saxon period, was, the appropriate vehicle. Yet, though French influence brought rhyme instead of alliteration to English poetry and restricted the range of English prose, and though the French language affected both the vocabulary and the pronunciation of English, Middle English literature between the early 12th and the late 15th centuries is, in many important respects, the heir of its Anglo-Saxon ancestry, and the elements which distinguish it most sharply from Anglo-Saxon literature are those which might well have flowed into it in the normal course of international cultural influence. The influence of French literary methods and French literary attitudes was felt all over Europe, and would have been felt in England even if there had been no Norman Conquest. We are entering the period of French cultural domination of Europe, which is a much more significant phenomenon even for English literature than William the Conqueror's victory in 1066. But if the long-term development of English literature was less affected by the Norman Conquest than might at first sight be imagined, there can be no doubt that the immediate effect of the conquest was to disrupt the course of English literature considerably. The position with regard to language was enough to ensure that, even though modern scholars tend to regard as exaggerated the older view which held that French was the regular language of the upper classes for more than 2.5 centuries after the conquest, and stress the evidence that points to daiches, or at least the knowledge of English among the upper classes outside the immediate circle of the comma court, the fact remains that for over 2 centuries, the literature produced under courtly or aristocratic patronage was French both in tone and in language, while literature in English was either rough and popular, much of it oral, and so lost, or simply didactic, written by the lower clergy with the object of instructing the common people in biblical story and the duties required by their one. I am using the term English to refer to the whole field of literature discussed in this book, as I regard the Anglo-Saxon phase as an integral part of the English literary tradition, the logical term to use for Anglo-Saxon for anyone with this point of view would be Old English, which gives us the neat tripartite division of the English language to Old English, Middle English, and Modern English, the co-Roman word English, emphasizing the continuity. Many modern scholars do this, yet Anglo-Saxon remains the older established and better known term, and it seems pedantic to refer, for example, to the well-known Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as the Old Anglo 4H Chronicle, as is sometimes now done. Middle English prose and verse. 33. Religion. The immediate form in which Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse survived was less technically subtle, more simply accentual, than the stricter form of the Anglo-Saxon period. It probably represented a popular oral tradition which was less likely to be affected by the displacement of polite English literature by French, and it was certainly a kind of verse which was more susceptible to the influence of the French rhyme couplet, toward which it moved. One might, indeed, distinguish 2 lines of development of the old Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse. One moves via this popular tradition toward the rhyme couplets of the French, the long alliterative line breaking into 2, acquiring rhyme, and becoming metrically regular. The other somehow made contact with the purer and stricter alliterative tradition and emerged in the so-called alliterative revival of the 14th century, which produced, in western and northern parts of the country where national English feeling had remained strongest, some of the most interesting works in the whole of Middle English literature. But if some aspects of the Anglo-Saxon verse tradition lingered on, the same cannot be said for the heroic note of Anglo-Saxon poetry. The Norman Conquest was itself the last of more than say many movements, migrations, invasions, and expeditions, which had ended the Roman Empire and brought a new Europe into being. By the beginning of the 12th century this new Europe had defined its total relation to the Roman past, had established itself as a Christian civilization, and had become sufficiently stable culturally to form its own norms of politeness both in life and in letters. The heroic age was gone, and new kinds of courtly sophistication replaced the heroic ideal in manners. There are, of course, links between the new Europe and the old, and we can trace the movement from the Johnson's daiches. With their sterner note of heroic endeavour they include the verse tales of Charlemagne and his peers to the Arthurian Romances, with their stress on courtly behaviour and new ideals of love and sentiment. Of these romances, more hereafter. At the moment we note merely that the old heroic note was dying away throughout Europe, because the new Europe of the Middle Ages was not a heroic society in the strict historical sense but a feudal society with its own conventions of service, honour, and obligation, its own kind of literary patronage, and its own social conditions breeding its own view of the relation between the sexes. The Norman Conquest did not bring this feudal organisation to England. It had been developing in late Anglo-Saxon times, but it certainly hastened the process and, what is more important to the literary historian, it brought England more MS4, Middle English prose and verse, into contact with continental civilization and especially with the new flowering of French culture which was to change the pattern of all medieval European literatures. Again, we must not imagine that Anglo-Saxon England had been isolated from the continent, and that it was not until 1066 that relations between England and the continent developed. There were in fact powerful Norman influences working in England in the generation before the conquest, and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, at the height of their prosperity, had many insignificant European contacts. But the Norman Conquest brought a more immediate, a more active, and a more continuous relationship with the continent, and, by imposing a French-speaking ruling caste on England, brought the achievements of the new French culture more rapidly and more forcibly to the attention of Englishmen. The story of English literature during the 2 centuries and a half after the Norman Conquest is the story of what the late 17th century critics were to call, with reference to the achievement of their own poets, the refinement over numbers. Forced back to its more popular elements, English literature soon began to rise again slowly in the social scale, gradually acquiring an ease, a skill, and a polish which would enable it to hold its own with French. The full and triumphant achievement of this new ease and skill and polish in the work of Chaucer coincides in date with the final re-establishment of English as the universal national language, the speech, both written and spoken, of both court and people. It was a very different language now from that of Beowulf or of Gelfric, having come under many influences in addition to undergoing those changes in pronunciation and word structure which any language undergoes with the passing of time. But it was the legitimate descendant of its Anglo-Saxon parent. The reader of English literature of this period is struck by the number of different Middle English dialects. It was not until toward the end of the Middle English period that the East Midland dialect became more or less the standard literary language. The reason for the number of Middle English literary dialects was that, as a result of the conquest, Wessex lost its political and cultural importance, and its dialect, West Saxon, which had established its supremacy as the literary language, therefore similarly lost its prestige, with the court and aristocratic circles using French. There was no force making for the supremacy of any one Middle English dialect over the others, so writers in English used the language of their own region. These regional dialects of Middle English were the descendants of their Anglo-Saxon ancestors, the Northern Middle English prose and verse. 35. Bryan dialect of Anglo-Saxon split up into Scots and Northern English. Mercian developed into East Midland and West Midland. West Saxon divided into the southwestern and central southern dialects, and Kentish became the basis of the dialects of the southeast. Where there is no central standard of polite usage, a language will always split up into regional dialects, which is of course why a popular literature, developing independently of polite standards, will tend to use the language of its own region, as in American folk song to this day. This also explains why, for example, Scots, originally a branch of Northumbrian English and later, as a result of its use by the Middle Scots poets, a fully developed literary language in its own right, split up into regional dialects after the Middle Ages, when, as a result of increasing association with England, Scotland more and more adopted Standard English as its literary language and thus lost its standard for polite Scots. Just as the eclipse of Wessex and the loss of the standardizing power of its language produced by the Norman Conquest and the emergence of French as the courtly language led Middle English to relapse into a series of dialects even as a written language, so the union of the crowns of England and Scotland in 1603 and the union of the parliaments of the two countries in 1707 made English the standard polite language of Scotland and split Scots up into the series of local dialects, which it has remained until our own time, when the movement of contemporary poets to create a synthetic Scots literary language is at last trying to reverse this trend. As French receded, even among the upper classes, and English moved slowly up in the social scale, the possibility of a new standard form of literary English grew steadily, until, by the end of the Middle English period, the dialect of London, now the dominant city of England, reigned supreme. The London dialect had originally been a southern dialect, with its characteristics largely southeastern, but by Chaucer's time it had become mainly East Midland and character, with the result that standard modern English derives from East Midland and not, as anyone looking at the English literary scene about the year 1050 might have predicted, West Saxon. The loss of Normandy by the English in 1204, and royal decrees in both England and France in 1224 making it illegal for anyone to hold land in both countries, must have helped to make the descendants of the Normans in England consider themselves bound /y to England and encourage the growth among them of the English language. Besides, it must be remembered that the Norman Conquest did not represent as did the invasions of the Saxons and the 36. Middle English prose and verse. Danes a national migration. The army brought to England by William, Duke of Normandy, consisted of no more than about 6,000 men, and some of these were mercenaries who returned across the Channel after the subjugation of England was completed in 1010. William gave English estates to his followers and made them into a small ruling class which replaced the Anglo-Saxon nobility, but underneath, English life went on very much as usual. It is true that Henry II, 1154 to 1189, the first of the Plantagenet kings, possessed vast realms in France, extending from the Channel to the Pyrenees, having inherited Normandy and Maine from his mother, and Anjou and Touraine from his father, and acquiring Poitou, Guyenne, and Gascony by his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Brittany through his son Geoffrey, who married Constance, heiress of the province. And throughout the late Middle English period English kings regarded themselves as the rightful kings of France, a claim which produced the 100 Years' War, which began in the anno 13382. But, though this intimate contact with France kept the influence of French culture very much alive in England, it could not prevent the steady rise of the English language until it became again, in the 14th century, the polite as well as the popular language of England. For the masses of Englishmen had spoken English all along. The classic document on the rehabilitation of English in educated circles is a paragraph in John of Treves' translation of the Polychronicon of Ralph Higden. Higden, writing about 1350, had stated, "That ever since the Normans came to England Englishmen have been forced to leave their native language and do everything in French, and that the children of gentlemen were taught to speak French from infancy." Treves, translating Higden's work from the Latin in 1385, adds his own comment on Higden's statement. Pejranir was mochway vscd to for p first morin, and usept soil de leach const. For lehan com y, a master of grammar, Shane G. P. Lore in grammar school and construction of French into English, and Richard Penquan, ch learned pat manor te king of Hem, and Oberman of Pencrick, so pat now. P3 of or Lord of House and Pre Hundred Fourscore and 5 of P Second King Richard after P Conquest 9, in all P grammar schools of Eng.Lond children Louet French, and Constru, and learn Pan English. To in spite of some impressive victories over the French, such as Cré and Poitiers, 1346 and 1356 respectively, the English never established their claim for any length of time. Even Henry V, who after his victory at Agincourt in 1415 and his triumphant entry into Paris had himself named the heir to the French throne, never lived to be King of France, and in the following reign, that of Henry VI, the revival of French national feeling resulted in the driving out of the English. By 1453, and the 100 Years' War, which had been far from continuous since 1338, came to an end. The only French possession left to the English was the port of Seafarer. Middle English prose and verse. 37. This was the general custom before the first plague, the Black Death of 1349, but things have changed now. For John Cornwall, a school teacher, changed the method of teaching in school and made his pupils translate from French into English, and Richard Pencrick learned that way of teaching from him. 35 did other men of Pencrick, so that now, 1385 AD, the 9th year of the reign of King Richard II, In all the grammar schools of England, children have abandoned French and translate and do their lessons in English. This sets the date of the change from French to English as the means of instruction, in schools fairly precisely, and when we realise that formal educational methods are always conservative and are slow to re-erect public opinion, we can see why the social and cultural rehabilitation of English can be said to have been achieved in the first half of the 14th century. English was introduced into the law courts in 1362, and English thought was used for the first time in the opening of Parliament in 1363. The work of Chaucer came in the immediately following decades. By this time, too, Anglo-French, the development of Norman French in England was giving way in England to Parisian French, the standard French of France, which indicated that its knowledge was a polite accomplishment rather than a native endowment. Besides French and English there was Latin, the learned language of Christian civilization. Latin had also, of course, been the learned language in Anglo-Saxon times, and it was only the dearth of good Latinalists in England that led to the use of Anglo-Saxon in serious didactic literature. We saw earlier how King Alfred's programme of translation was caused by his fear that Latin had declined throughout the country. This illustrates very clearly how ignorance of a kind can encourage the growth of a vernacular literature, a not uncommon phenomenon in the history of culture. Anglo-Saxon literary prose was among the best developed in Europe, and far more advanced than French prose. But had the Danish invasions not produced a decay of Latin learning, it would never have developed as it did. The ecclesiastical reforms introduced into England by the Normans restored Latin as the language of serious didactic works and thus did grave harm to the tradition of English literary prose. As we shall see, the tradition did survive, to re-emerge impressively later. With the Latin literature of medieval England we are not concerned in this history, though no one who wishes to understand the at least, an Act of Parliament of the year ordered that all pleas should be conducted in English, but in fact French remained the language of the law courts for much longer. 38. Middle English prose and verse. Literary culture of the Middle Ages can ignore it. Latin was not only the language of theological and didactic works, it was also the language of science, philosophy, history, and a great deal of poetry. Latin was also used for all official documents, and was the legal language of Norman England until it was replaced by Anglo-French in the 13th century. Anglo-French remained the official legal language of England until 1731. Perhaps the most interesting Latin prose works produced in England in the early Middle English period were the histories. Such Anglo-Latin historians as William of Malmesbury, whose histories of England show both learning and a critical judgment, and Matthew Paris, the greatest of the 12th century English historians, are of more interest to students of historiography than to those concerned primarily with literature, but the Historia Regum Britanniae of Geoffrey of Monmouth, written in the 3rd decade of the 12th century, provided a mine of material which was later to be fruitfully employed by poets and romancers. Geoffrey was a Welshman, and drew on old British traditions, including the Welsh historians Gildas and Ennius. He gives us a picture of the Anglo-Saxon invasion seen through the eyes of the retreating Britons, and his pages are filled with figures which were to become famous in imaginative literature. Here we first find the stories of Lear and Cymbeline and Gorboduc, and here, most important of all, we get the first full-dress story of the exploits of King Arthur. It is Arthur himself, rather than his knights, who keeps the centre of the picture. We hear nothing yet of Lancelot or Tristan, but we have Uther Pendragon and Merlin. We have the treachery of Arthur's nephew Mordred and the disloyalty of Guianhamara, Guinevere, and L have the final bearing of the mortally wounded Arthur to Avalon. Arthur is a great hero to Geoffrey, rather than a great symbolic figure in the background, as he was later to become, and the knights by whom he is surrounded are loyal feudal retainers rather than epitomes of courtly virtues. Geoffrey has Arthur successful in war against enemies both at home and abroad, until, rejecting Rome's demand for tribute, he sets out to conquer Rome itself. But the disloyalty of Mordred and of Guinevere recalls him, and so the story goes to the last great battle and the journey to Avalon. Here is the outline of the story that so much later medieval literature was to use as a grand backlith for innumerable individual incidents. The De Nugis Curialium, Courtiers' Trifles, of Walter Map is another 12th century Latin work likely to interest the reader of medieval English literature, though for very different reasons from those which lead him to Geoffrey of Monmouth. It is a lively Middle English prose and verse. 39. Lection of the most miscellaneous material, loosely organized in the form of a satire on contemporary abuses. It contains anecdotes, folk tales, pieces of invective, witty observations, amusing stories, and similar entertaining matter, and its existence is a reminder that medieval Latin was not the language only of solemn works. Walter Map was long credited with many of those lively Latin lyrics satirical, amorous, irreverent, bacchanalian, and sometimes indecent which belong to medieval Goliardic tradition, the tradition of the wandering scholars, the rollicking secular protest against official Christendoms focusing on the next world. How many of these poems, if any, Map himself wrote is not known, but Goliardic poetry, with its secular moods and its frequent metrical skill, represents a chapter of European poetry of the greatest interest to anyone concerned with any of the European literatures. The movement from classical Latin quantitative verse to the rhymed, accentual Latin verse of medieval hymns and of these Goliardic poems represents a major shift in the nature of the European ear for poetry, one might almost say, and it can be studied more happily than elsewhere in the fascinating literature of the wandering scholars. The clear voice of the disinterested lyrist comes to us from the Middle Ages more often than we realize in the Latin words of some impoverished but singing scholar. Musa venit Carmen, Dulce modulamin, Paralter cantamus. The muse comes with song, with sweet harmoniae, let us sing. 2. There was also an important Anglo-French literature in England in the 12th and 13th centuries. Much of it is religious and didactic, and we must never forget that by far the largest number of medieval works in any language are religious and didactic, of which only a few have any strictly literary interest. Among them the allegorical poem Le Chaste d'Amour by the brilliant and learned Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, where praise of the Virgin and many aspects of Christian theology are presented through an elaborate allegory of a castle and its defenders. The lively and metrically interesting voyage of St. Brendan, with its rich collection of marvellous adventures, is another Anglo-French poem of some literary interest today. There are also many Anglo-French chroniclers, among whom by far the most significant for the reader of English literature. 40. Middle English prose and verse is Wace, whose translation of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, in the middle of the 12th century, represented an important stage in the transmission of the Arthurian legend. Wace's Roman de Brut, as his work is generally called, is more than a simple translation of Geoffrey of Monmouth. He also includes Arthurian stories from other sources, and is the first actually to mention the Round Table, though his references to it seem to indicate that it was already known to his readers. The Roman de Brut consists of 15,000 lines of verse, done with vivacity and a feeling for dramatic incident that strike the imagination more forcibly than the straightforward historical narrative of Geoffrey of Monmouth. It is with the translation of Wace's Roman de Brut by Lemon early in the 13th century that the Arthurian story first appears in English. Works in French written in England during this period also include a number of romances, verse stories written purely for entertainment, and some shorter verse narratives, generally based on folklore and often dealing with the supernatural, to which the name Breton lays has long been given. The lie is of Celtic origin, and seems to have derived both from Welsh and Breton horses. Brittany, it will be remembered, was settled by fugitives from Britain after the Anglo-Saxon invasions, so that the Bretons were very closely akin, both in akin and traditions, to the Britons of Wales and Cornwall. They spoke almost the same Celtic tongue and cherished alike the Arthurian and other Celtic British legends. The best-known author of lays was Marie de France, who was apparently born in France, but wrote in England and dedicated her lays to King Henry II. Of the romances we shall speak in greater detail later, They represent one of the most important branches of medieval secular literature and require separate treatment. Anglo-French literature, whether written in the form of French which, since King John's loss of Normandy in 1204, had been developing in its own way in England, or written in England in the French of Paris, was part of the wider stream of French literature which, partly because of the Norman Conquest but more fundamentally because of the extraordinary efflorescence of French literature in the 12th century, swept into English literature in the Middle English period and moved it far away from the Anglo-Saxon heroic mould. We shall have to look more closely, therefore, at French literature and the techniques, attitudes, and subject matter which is introduced. But what, meantime, was happening to the native Anglo-Saxon tradition? In poetry, there is little extant to show precisely what was. Middle English prose and verse, 41, happening in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. We have some fragments of religious and didactic poetry which are sufficient to indicate the Anglo-Saxon alliterative line was continued, though in a looser and more popular form. The Worcester fragments, so called because they consist of the remnants of a manuscript which had been cut up and pasted together to make the covers of a book in the library of Worcester Cathedral, preserve, in addition to portions of Alfred's grammar, in West Saxon, a short deme lamenting that the people are no longer taught in English, as they used to be in Anglo-Saxon by the great Anglo-Saxon saints and scholars, but are left in ignorance by foreign teachers, so that both teachers and people are damned together. Nus pio or forliten and pet folis forlerin. Nu be op oprilioden pio hera beautiful. And fiol of pen lorpines los iren pet full fort mid. Now is this teaching abandoned and the people is lost. Now it is men of other languages that teach of people, and many of the teachers are damned and the people is when. The language here is early Middle English, and probably represents a late 12th century scribe, about 1180, transcribing into his own West Midland dialect a poem originally written in West Saxon soon after the conquest. The language is, indeed, transitional between Anglo-Saxon and Middle English and is nearer to the language of Alfred than to that of Chaucer. The verse form is still the Anglo-Saxon alliterative line, though looser. Than in classical Anglo-Saxon poetry, but neither this poem nor the fragmentary debate between the body and the soul which follows it is of any general literary interest. Their interest lies in their illustration of the development of the language and of the verse forms of the Anglo-Saxons in the 12th century. The development can be traced further in much religious and didactic literature, including paraphrases of parts of the Bible, though there is little else that is so close to Anglo-Saxon tradition. We soon begin to see the increasing influence of French models, an influence particularly noticeable where, as often happened, the Middle English work was itself a translation from the French. A startling break with any tradition is the curious Ormulum, writ. 10 probably about the year 1200 by an Augustinian canon named Ormond. Orm's intention was to translate into English verse the Gospels that were read in the Mass during the whole year, but the verse he used employed neither the rhyme of the French nor 42. Middle English prose and verse. Anglo-Saxon alliteration, depending simply and wholly on strict syllabic regularity. It can be best illustrated by quoting the opening tilde line. Pes hocis nemned orulum forpi patomit. Wrote. This book is called Ormulum, because GRM made it. This is the first of the 10,000 extant lines of the poem. Fortunately, only about 1/8 of the whole survives, and each of the other lines is of exactly the same length. Each has precisely the same metrical pattern, with 15 syllables and a feminine ending, and there is nothing to vary the intolerable monotony. Orm's spelling is also original. It is a phonetic spelling, with a double consonant after every short vowel except when the vowel is in an open syllable, whatever his reason for doing this, and it has been much debated. He produced a very odd-looking text, interesting to philologists but of more than usual tedium to the general reader. Orm's metre is not ill itself unusual if we divide his line into two we get the standard ballad measure. He turned his face onto the wall, and death was with him dealing. Adieu, adieu, my dear friends all. and Be Kind to Barbara Allen. Wordsworth was partial to it. And H, K / Hugh Blythe the T / T / 1 / He, too, is no mean preacher. Come forth into the light of things. Let nature be your teacher. But Wordsworth and the ballad writers at least had the variety of rhyme, and none of them ran to 10,000 lines. Or might have done better to accept the French rhyming Faspian, which was now beginning to come into Middle English religious and didactic verse. The 400-line poem Morale, or more. LL poem is a late 12th century versified sermon written in the same metre as the Ormulum, but with more flexibility in employing rhyme. Though hardly the most exciting of poems, the poem Morale has a certain vigour and some signs of personal feeling that are wholly lacking in the Ormulum. It deals with the usual medieval religious gomer in places lost opportunities in this life, the last judgment, the horrors of hell, the joys of heaven, the call to repentance, but the note of earnest conviction which comes through saves it from being the purely mechanical rehearsal of commonplaces. Middle English prose and verse. 43. Once the Middle English writers had learned rhyme, nothing could stop them, and a didactic writer or long-winded romancer given his head in a clippety-clop metre was very hard to stop. Octosyllabic couplets could go on forever. Many Aems rhymes for to hear, and Romans read on manor essir, of Alexander P. Conqueror, of Lully Cesse P. Emperor, O Greece and Troy the Strangstridge, per many thousand lesses third, O Brit that burn bald of hand, P. First Conqueror of Longland, O King Arthur Pat was so rike, quam none in his time was like, O Furless Pat his noths fell, Pat hunters seer I hear of tell, Als wowan, kine opers to bell, for two were Pirons ha bell, how Charles King and Roland fat, with Saracens walled Pat in Assat, O Tristram and his leafy soat, how he for here become a sate, O Einek and of Isambres, O Edoin and of Ahmed.se. This is the opening of the Cursor Mundi, an enormous poem of some 30,000 lines which deals with all the important incidents of both Old and New Testament story and a great variety of moral and religious topics. The poem, which dates from the last quarter of the 13th century, is encyclopedic in scope, and is carried along through its varied subject matter by its author's determined and not unskilful rhyming. It is a good introduction to the medieval view of world history and of much else, and serves to remind us once again of the didactic purpose of so much medieval writing. With properly varied rhymes and metrical skill which took a long time to develop, the Middle English poet was able to achieve something far removed from anything possible to his Anglo-Saxon predecessor, and even the most stereotyped religious subject could be made fresh and moving with the proper lilt and the proper imagery. One of the earliest successful religious poems in Middle English is the 12th century Love written by Thomas of Hales. It urges the vanity and transience of earthly love and advocates instead the love. 44. Middle English prose and verse. Of Christ. The traditional theme of Ubi ront qui ante nos fuerat, where are those who lived before us, rings out with a new confidence. Where is Paris and Helene? Pat were in so brilliant and fair on blue. Facile. Amadis and Ideen, Tristram, Isid and Elpio. Hector, whip his scarp mane. And Caesar, reach off words feel, well thigh. He will be op hegliden viti of Pirene, Worldle. So P chef is of Piclio. As the sheaf is from the hillside, or as the sheaf is cut by the reaping hook. L. This sounds the true note of medieval plaingency, a note sounded first, as far as the Middle Ages knew, by the late 5th and early 6th century Roman philosopher Boethius, one of the most popular writers in the Middle Ages, translated both by King Alfred and by Chaucer. Boethius had asked, Ubi nunc fidelis ossa Fabrici manent, quid Brutus aut rigidus Cato? Where now lie the bones of the faithful Fabricius? What now is Brutus or upright Cato? King Alfred, in his rendering, substitutes for the remote classical character figures nearer home, and asks, where are now the bones of the famous and wise Smith Wayland, and who knows where they be? A late 13th century English lyrist asked the same question, where be they pat before in Usweren, that when, before us, hounds laden and Havksburen, ned hounds and carried hawks, and hadden felled in wood, selled in forest, and a century later, in France, villain was to ask, dicts meo, nem q1 pes, est flor, la belle romaine, archipiada, natais, qui fut saccausin genin, echo, parlant quant briet on main, disisrevi eros as estin, qui bo, o1 trop plus cubimain, mesu sunt les nigstandan. Middle English prose and verse. 45. A sense of transience of earthly life pressed hard on the Middle Ages, and medieval writers developed their own kind of cadence for its expression. It is equally far removed from Aeschylus' stem sense of fate, from the chastened melancholy of Sophocles, and from the civilized, almost self-indulgent sadness of Virgil, nor has it anything of the thoughtful introspection of Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. It is perhaps a simpler note than any of these, and it comes impressively into medieval literature only after the development of rhyme and metre had made it possible for medieval poets to express it with a special kind of lyric lilt. Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse was an effective medium for the older heroic poetry, but new kinds of sensibility demanded a lighter and more flexible mode of expression. The new rhyme and metre that the French brought to Europe meant, as we have said, a change in the European ear, but that corresponded to a deeper change, a change in European sensibility. The octosyllabic couplet, which English learned from French, is not always, even in the early Middle English period, handled by determined and long-winded didactic writers. Apart from its use in romances, it is found in a variety of works. One of the earliest appearances of this first form in English is one of the most successful. In the vivacious The Owl and the Nightingale, written probably around 1200, the first example in English of the debate, the contest in verse between two or more speakers. The verse debate had become a literary convention in both Latin and French, and could serve a great many different purposes. In The Owl and the Nightingale, the two birds, who pursue their altercation with great spirit and with all the legal tricks of a 12th century lawsuit, presumably stand allegorically for two ways of life, the monastic and the secular, or for two kinds of poetry, the didactic and the amorous. The Nightingale is the more sympathetic character to modern readers, but, though the conflict is unresolved by the end of the poem, the owl would appear to have won on points. But whatever the allegorical intention, it is clear that the author delighted in the dramatic quality of the poem and that his main interest lay in giving life and spirit to a conventional form. The narrative is handled with an accomplished ease, and the dialogue succeeds in painting with great vividness not only the characters of the two speakers, the respectable owl and the hedonistic nightingale, but also aspects of the daily life of the period. But these exceptional instances of accomplished early Middle English poems must not be allowed to obscure the fact that the recovery of an English poetic style after the Norman Conquest was a 46. Middle English prose and verse, slow business, and was not generally accomplished until the 14th century. There were individual successful poems before the 14th century, but no great English poet. The substitution of rhyme and metre for the Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse was not the result of a revolution in taste and attitude, such as some literary historians have seen in the Romantic movement. It was a slow process of imitation of an adaptation from the French, with the English language itself continually growing in vocabulary and inflexibility until it reached the point where it could handle the new verse form with confidence and variety. Without the French element in Middle English vocabulary, the possibilities for rhyme would have been very restricted. Some of the early Middle English poems we have quoted above will show how the native Anglo-Saxon tradition gave way to the new rhyming fashion, but the alliterative tradition was not altogether dead. We can see it, in its more popular form, in Lyman's Brut, a metrical history of Britain based on Wace's Roman de Brut and written sometime in the late 12th century. Lyman's verse lacks the careful parallelism of Anglo-Saxon verse as well as such Anglo-Saxon poetic devices as the kenning, and his lines have become purely accentual in rhythm, but he uses alliteration and no rhyme. More impressive testimony to the survival and even development of the Anglo-Saxon alliterative tradition is the group of accomplished alliterative poems which suddenly appear in the 14th century. These include romances, religious poems, and satirical and allegorical works. In the last group is the well-known Piers Plowman, to be discussed later, and among the romances is the remarkable Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, one of the most brilliant !Healthy of all Middle English allegorical tales of adventure and of the marvellous, written in alliterative blank verse, each paragraph of which concludes with 4 short lines, having alternate rhyme. Among the religious poems of the so-called alliterative revival are 3 which are found in the same manuscript as Sir Gawain. They are Patience, Purity, and Peril, of which the first is a homily on the virtues of patience illustrated by an effective recounting of the story of Jonah, and the last is both an elegy on the poet's dead daughter and an allegory of Christian faith, one of the most interesting and skillful religious poems of the Middle Ages. In prose, it is told easier to trace the continuity of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Its variety and liveliness had made Anglo-Saxon prose remarkable among European literatures of the period. Translations, homilies, and didactic, devotional, and informative works of many Middle English prose and verse. 47 kinds were to be found in prose, while in the Anglo-Saxon chronicle a tradition of historical prose was maintained for centuries. Copying of Anglo-Saxon prose works went on assiduously in monasteries all to the Conquest, and the chronicle was continued. The last entry was made in the Peterborough Chronicle in the middle of the 12th century, after a gap caused probably by the confusions of King Stephen's reign, and it is between the language of this final scribe and that of his predecessor who brought the narrative up to 1132 that scholars have drawn the necessarily somewhat arbitrary line between Anglo-Saxon, Old English, and Middle English. This was the end of the Anglo-Saxon tradition of historical prose, and England now loses its lead in the development of more than one angular historical writing. The Norman clerics who took over the local and national administrative positions in England after the Conquest introduced Latin as the language of official communication and historical record, and English historical prose did not emerge again until the time of the Tudors. At the same time, French influence was leading English writers to turn to rhymed verse rather than prose for historical and other kinds of writing which had been prose in Anglo-Saxon times, while the increase of dialectical differences in Middle English helped to make a standard literary prose impossible. As far as English historical prose was concerned, then as with such other arts as manuscript illumination, metalwork, and jewellery, the Norman Conquest put the clock back. In homiletic and devotional prose, however, the tradition was not lost. In spite of handicaps, the work of instructing the people in the vernacular went on after the Conquetil dynasty. Here the fall from supremacy of the West Saxon literary language in favour of different local dialects was less significant, for instruction of the common people could in any case be most effectively done in their own dialect. Thus the Anglo-Saxon homiletic tradition carrying on the work of Eric Wlth Mearnising Odildana Oceans to his sermons continue less than to flourish, and English religious prose prospered side by side with the new French verse renderings of similar literature. This WLL. is especially true in the west of England. In the southeast, French seems to have predominated even in this field early in the 13th century, but the massive homiletic literature in the West Midland dialect of this period carried English religious prose safely through the danger period to provide continuity with the prose of Tudor times. The fact that Wuston, Bishop of Worcester, retained his see after the Conquest until his death in 1095 must have helped to encourage this vernacular prose tradition in the West. It is significant that after his 48 Middle English prose and verse death his biography was written in English by Coleman, a Worcester monk. The sermons, translations, saints' lives, and other devotional and didactic works in which this prose tradition manifests itself are of little literary interest, though they are of importance to the philologist and to the historian of thought and society. The earliest writings of this kind after the Conquest are those known as the Catherine group, and include the lives of 3 virgin saints, Catherine, Martilde and Juliana, a treatise pointing out the discomforts of marriage and the advantages of virginity, and a prose homily in which Wit, the informed master, and Will, the foolish mistress, appear struggling, amid a great number of allegorical figures, for control of the soul. These works are written in a conscious literary prose, with youth, especially in the 3 saints' lives, of alliteration and deliberate rhythmic effects. They were addressed to a female audience, as was the Anchornrowell, a manual of instruction intended for 3 young girls who had decided to become anchoresses. In addition to the usual devotional and didactic material, the Anchornrowell contains much lively incidental material by way of illustration, and the author's use of proverb, anecdote, character sketch, and realistic detail, as well as numerous references to matters of daily life, domestic affairs, farming, travel, sport, among other aspects, makes the work an important and interesting historical document, as well as providing it with a human interest which the modern reader appreciates so much more than the conventional didactic element. It was written probably about 1200 in the West Midland dialect, and its influence and popularity were enormous. Its influence on the religious prose of the 13th and 14th centuries was largely instrumental in ensuring the transmission of the prose tradition of the Anglo-Saxon homilies to such writers as Richard Rolle of Hampole, the 14th century mystical and devotional writer, and his follower Walter Hilton. Rolle is important both for the movement of devotional piety, with its ascetic bias and lyrical development of personal feeling in religious matters, which he founded, and for the clarity and cogency of his prose, which is in the northern dialect of Yorkshire. There is a modern ring to Rolle's prose style, partly because he tends to reduce the inflections as in modern English, but more significantly because of the simple directness of his word order. His rhymed verse is technically less distinguished. Of Rolle's followers, Walter Hilton, who died in 1396, is the most interesting, and his prose work The Scale of Perfection, which debates the respective claims of the active and the contemplative life, is another important document in the Middle English Prose and Verse. 49. History of English Prose Style. How unreadable 14th century religious treatises could be when devoid of any personal inspiration or stylistic grace, can be seen in Michael of Northcote's Bite of Inwit, Prick of Conscience, a translation of a 13th century didactic work done with an infuriating mechanical dullness, not even accurately, and not always intelligibly. This is the work whose title haunts Stephen Dedalus in Joyce's Ulysses, symbolizing his feeling of guilt with reference to his mother. Its importance has been magnified by philologists, to whom it is a great treasure, for it is written in the pure Kentish dialect of Canterbury and its date is known precisely, a note at the end of the manuscript making clear that it was finished on October the 27th. 1340. Contemporary with Walter Hilton is John Wycliffe, a very different figure from any member of the Rolle group, for Rolle was a contemplative mystic by temperament and sought to withdraw from the world, while Wycliffe, controversialist, philosopher, politician, and reformer, was with his followers responsible not only for attacks on some important claims and practices of the Church but also for the first complete translation of the Bible into English. The Wycliffe Bible is certainly not all translated by Wycliffe, but it was done under his inspiration. Nicholas of Hereford seems to have done part of the earlier of the two versions, finished between 1382 and 1384, A_.